What if the oldest stories ever written weren't meant to record beginnings, but to preserve warnings about endings that had already come to pass? What if beneath the shifting sands of ancient Iraq lies evidence that our understanding of human history has been fundamentally backwards all along? Tonight, as shadows lengthen and the world grows quiet, we'll explore clay tablets that whisper of impossible reigns, divine kings, and a catastrophe so complete it resets civilization itself. Before we journey into these forgotten realms, consider subscribing if you're drawn to the kind of mysteries that blur the line between history and legend. And if you're still here as the evening settles round you, leave a comment sharing where you're listening from and what draws you to these ancient puzzles. There's something magical about exploring lost worlds together across time zones, each of us carrying these stories into sleep. Our tale begins not with grand discoveries or eureka moments, but with patient archaeologists brushing centuries of dust from fragments that refuse to make sense. In the final decades of the 19th century, scholars working near the ruins of what we now know as ancient Uruk and Eridu began unearthing thousands upon thousands of clay tablets. Their expectations were modest. Surely these would reveal the fumbling first attempts of early humans learning to write, crude symbols scratched uncertainly into soft clay by people just beginning to grasp the concept of recorded language. Instead, they found something that challenged every assumption about how civilizations develop. The tablets revealed a society that seemed to have emerged fully formed, possessing sophisticated mathematical systems, urban planning that displayed geometric precision, legal codes written with elegant complexity, and astronomical records accurate enough to make modern scientists pause in wonder. The Sumerians hadn't gradually developed their knowledge over centuries of trial and error. They appeared in the historical record as if stepping directly from the ruins of something far more ancient. This wasn't the expected slow crawl from primitive to advanced. The earliest Sumerian cities weren't chaotic collections of mud huts growing organically around water sources. They were planned communities laid out with mathematical precision, their streets forming perfect grids, their temples oriented to catch specific celestial alignments, their irrigation systems engineered with a sophistication that shouldn't have existed at humanity's supposed dawn. Even more puzzling, their written language appeared without ancestors, a fully developed system of communication that linguists still struggle to classify, because it stands alone in the family tree of human speech. What made these discoveries truly unsettling was how the Sumerians themselves described their origins. They didn't claim to be inventors or pioneers breaking new ground. Instead, their tablets spoke repeatedly of restoration, of rebuilding what had existed before. One inscription found its way to a museum in Berlin, where it sits today behind protective glass, carrying a message that continues to puzzle scholars. The carved symbols translate simply but provocatively. This is the restoration of what was before. That single word, restoration, transforms everything. If the Sumerians were rebuilding rather than building, if they were restoring rather than creating, then what exactly had been lost? What kind of world had existed before theirs, and what catastrophe had been so complete that only fragments remained to guide the reconstruction? Hold one of these tablets if you could, and feel the weight of baked clay in your palm. Run your fingers across the wedge-shaped impressions that still carry the rhythm of hands that worked 5,000 years ago. Sometimes, when museum curators examine these artifacts under magnification, they discover something remarkable. Fingerprints pressed into the clay before it dried, the unique ridges and whorls of individuals who lived before every empire we know by name. Those ancient hands recorded far more than simple trade agreements or tax records. Hidden among the administrative documents are medical texts describing surgical procedures, astronomical charts tracking planetary movements with startling precision, and mathematical formulas that wouldn't be rediscovered by other cultures for over a millennium. One tablet from the ancient city of Nipper records the orbital period of Venus with an accuracy that matches modern calculations, a feat that should have required generations of careful observation using instruments the Sumerians supposedly didn't possess. The anomalies multiply the deeper researchers dig. Bronze tools appear in archaeological layers that predate the Bronze Age. Cylinder seals depict mechanical devices that seem centuries ahead of their time. Most intriguingly, archaeologists have uncovered what appears to be an ancient battery, a clay jar containing copper and iron components that can generate electrical current when filled with acidic liquid, found in layers dating back over 2,000 years. But perhaps the most compelling mystery lies in the stories themselves. The Sumerians wrote extensively about a great flood that had destroyed an earlier world, washing away cities and civilizations in a deluge so complete that only carefully chosen survivors remained to carry forward essential knowledge. This wasn't unique to them. The same story appears in Akkadian texts, Hebrew scriptures, Hindu epics, and even in the codices of distant Mesoamerican cultures. How could peoples separated by vast oceans and thousands of years all preserve the memory of the same catastrophic event? When archaeologists finally uncovered the ruins of Uruk, they expected to find the humble beginnings of urban life. Instead, they discovered city walls stretching for miles, monumental temples aligned with astronomical precision, and beneath one ancient ziggurat, a library containing over 40,000 clay tablets. Here was a civilization that had documented itself with extraordinary thoroughness, yet every answer seemed to generate more questions. Their mathematics was based on the number 60 rather than 10, a system so sophisticated that we still use it to measure time and angles. Their maps of the heavens showed familiarity with celestial mechanics that suggested centuries of accumulated observations. Their understanding of geometry and engineering allowed them to construct monuments that modern architects study with admiration. How had they learned so much so quickly, unless they hadn't learned it at all, but remembered it instead? Some researchers propose that Sumerian civilization emerged from centuries of gradual development, built upon the achievements of smaller settlements that have since been lost to erosion and time. Others suggest something more dramatic, that the Sumerians inherited their knowledge from an even earlier people, survivors of the cataclysms that mark the end of the last ice age. The most provocative theory of all reads their tablets literally, interpreting the gods who descended from heaven not as spiritual beings, but as teachers, travellers, or remnants of a civilization that predated humanity itself. Even the most cautious scholars admit that something unusual happened in ancient Mesopotamia. Civilizations aren't supposed to appear fully formed with agriculture, writing, law, medicine, and astronomy, all emerging simultaneously. The archaeological record typically shows gradual development, false starts, periods of advancement followed by decline. But the Sumerian tablets reveal something different, not trial and error, but refinement of existing knowledge, as if what we call the birth of civilization was actually its rebirth. In museums around the world, these clay tablets rest in climate-controlled cases, their wedge-shaped marks still clearly visible after 5 millennia. Each one represents a voice from a world we can barely imagine, preserved by people who understood that knowledge could vanish if not carefully protected. They wrote not just to record their present, but to ensure that their past would not be forgotten, even if the world itself should end again. Tonight, as darkness settles and the modern world grows quiet, those ancient voices still whisper from their clay prisons. They speak of kings whose reigns lasted impossibly long, of gods who walked among mortals, of knowledge that descended from heaven, and of a flood so devastating that it divided history itself into before and after. Whether we choose to hear their whispers as mythology or as testimony, their message remains hauntingly clear. We are not the first to build civilization, and we may not be the last to lose it. The story continues to unfold in the silence between those wedge-shaped marks, in the space between what was written and what was lost, where questions hover like desert heat over ancient ruins, waiting for someone willing to listen to what the clay remembers. The most haunting document to emerge from those ancient ruins reads like a chronicle, written by someone who had lost faith in mortality itself. Carved into clay with the same methodical precision used for grain receipts and trade agreements, the Sumerian king list presents us with numbers that seem to mock our understanding of human lifespan. 8 rulers, it claims, governed the world before the Great Deluge, and their reigns stretch across eons that dwarf entire civilizations. Alulim, the first of these impossible monarchs, ruled for 28,800 years. His successor, Alalgar, held power for 36,000 years. Enmenluana's reign lasted 43,200 years. The pattern continues, each name paired with a city we know existed, each reign measured in spans of time that feel more geological than human. Together, these 8 Prediluvian kings governed for over 240,000 years, a period so vast it contains the entire recorded history of our species several times over. Then, with jarring abruptness, the tablet records a single line that changes everything. The flood swept over. After that boundary, something fundamental shifts in the record. The kings who follow rule for centuries rather than millennia, then decades, then lifespans we recognize as human. The impossible gives way to the merely improbable, which eventually yields to the familiar rhythm of mortal rule. What makes this document so unsettling isn't its fantastic claims, but its mundane presentation. This wasn't written as mythology or religious poetry. It bears the same bureaucratic tone found in tax records and temple inventories, copied and recopied across centuries with the careful precision of official documents. The cities mentioned in the list are real places that archaeologists have excavated. The scribes who preserved this record were the same ones who meticulously documented grain shipments and worker wages with mathematical accuracy. So why would a culture obsessed with precision and record-keeping inscribe what appears to be fantasy alongside their most practical documents? Some scholars dismiss the enormous numbers as symbolic exaggerations, meant to lend divine authority to later rulers. Others suggest they represent astronomical cycles rather than individual lifespans, with each reign corresponding to vast celestial periods measured by planetary alignments rather than human heartbeats. But there's another possibility that hovers at the edges of academic discourse, like a half-remembered dream. What if these numbers weren't meant to measure time as we understand it, but to measure something else entirely? The Sumerians used a mathematical system based on the number 3600, which they called a psalm. Almost every reign in the pre-Diluvian section of the king list divides evenly into multiples of this unit. Alalim's 28,800 years equals exactly 8 sars. Alalga's 36,000 years equals 10 sars. The precision is too deliberate to be accidental, too consistent to be error. These weren't random numbers inflated by centuries of retelling. They were calculations, measurements of something the Sumerians considered as real and quantifiable as the movement of stars or the flooding of rivers. Perhaps they were recording not the lifespans of individual rulers, but the duration of ages themselves, epochs so vast that only celestial mechanics could measure them properly. In their cosmology, kingship didn't originate with human ambition or tribal leadership. It descended from heaven, bestowed by beings who governed according to cosmic rather than earthly principles. The pre-Diluvian rulers might have been understood not as mortal kings, but as embodiments of celestial forces, guardians of astronomical ages, representatives of cosmic order who maintained their positions until the stars themselves decreed a change. Yet even this interpretation raises questions that echo through the silence of ancient libraries. Why would a practical, bureaucratic culture encode astronomy into their royal genealogies unless they believed the two were inseparable? Why preserve these impossible numbers with such care unless they contained some essential truth that couldn't be lost? The answer may lie in what the tablets tell us about the flood itself. This wasn't described as divine punishment for human wickedness, though later cultures would interpret it that way. To the Sumerians, the deluge was presented as a cosmic reset, a moment when the old order ended and a new one began. Knowledge that had once flowed freely from heaven to earth was suddenly severed. Direct communication between gods and mortals ceased. The impossible became merely human. Everything that came after the flood represented not progress, but recovery. Every temple built, every law written, every star chart carved into stone was an attempt to reconstruct what had been lost. The Sumerians saw themselves not as pioneers blazing new trails, but as archaeologists of their own forgotten past, piecing together fragments of a shattered world. This perspective transforms our understanding of their remarkable achievements. Their sudden appearance with advanced mathematics, sophisticated urban planning, and precise astronomical knowledge begins to make sense if they weren't inventing these things, but remembering them. The absence of gradual development in their civilization becomes explicable if they were working from blueprints rather than building from scratch. The flood, in their understanding, hadn't just destroyed cities and populations, it had broken the very connection between heaven and earth, severing the link through which divine knowledge had once descended freely. What remained were fragments, pieces of a larger puzzle that survivors had to reassemble without fully understanding the original design. Each tablet they inscribed, each temple they raised, each ritual they performed was an act of desperate preservation, an attempt to keep alive whatever pieces of the old world they could still grasp. Consider the implications of this worldview. If the Sumerians were correct, if they were indeed rebuilding rather than building, then human civilization as we know it represents not our first attempt at complex society, but our second. Somewhere beneath the flood layers that archaeologists have found in Mesopotamian excavations lie the remains of an earlier world, one whose achievements we're only beginning to rediscover. The evidence for such a lost civilization remains fragmentary, scattered across disciplines and continents like pieces of a vast puzzle, megalithic structures that predate known civilizations by millennia, flood myths preserved by cultures with no apparent connection to each other, technologies that appear in the archaeological record without predecessors, mathematical knowledge that seems too advanced for its supposed time period. Each anomaly stands alone, easily dismissed as coincidence or misinterpretation. But taken together, they begin to form a pattern that echoes the Sumerian claim that we are not the first to reach for the stars, and that the knowledge we think we're discovering for the first time may actually be knowledge we're remembering. As night deepens and the world around us settles into silence, these ancient voices continue their patient testimony from museums and archives around the globe. They speak in wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay by hands that believed they were preserving the last echoes of a drowned world. Whether we choose to hear them as historians or storytellers, their message carries the weight of authentic terror. That everything we build can be lost, that knowledge can vanish as completely as if it never existed, and that the greatest civilizations may be those whose names we will never know, because even their memory has been washed away. The tablets remain, waiting in their climate-controlled cases, still whispering their impossible chronologies into the darkness, still counting the years of kings whose reigns lasted longer than mountains, whose names mark the boundary between the world that was and the world that is, still preserving in their own mysterious way the last testament of whatever came before. The flood swept over, and the age of gods gave way to the age of men. Way to the age of men. The deeper we venture into these ancient archives, the more we encounter something that defies our most basic assumptions about how knowledge develops. Scattered among the hymns and royal proclamations, archaeologists discovered what can only be described as technical manuals, documents stripped of mythological flourishes and divine invocations. These tablets contain pure distilled information, metallurgical formulas specifying exact copper-to-tin ratios for bronze alloys, architectural blueprints employing geometric principles, medical texts, cataloguing pharmaceutical compounds with precise dosage instructions, and astronomical calculations so accurate that modern computers were needed to verify their correctness. These weren't the tentative experiments of a civilization learning through trial and error. They read like the careful transcriptions of a people desperately trying to preserve knowledge they already possessed but feared losing. Every formula, every measurement, every calculation carries the precision of inherited wisdom rather than discovered truth. One tablet, catalogued simply as VAT 4924, records Venus's synodic cycle with stunning accuracy. 584 days, the exact time required for our neighbouring planet to return to the same position relative to Earth and Sun. This measurement demands not just casual skywatching, but generations of methodical observation, mathematical sophistication, and instruments capable of tracking planetary motion with remarkable consistency. Ancient Greek astronomers wouldn't achieve such precision for another 2 millennia. European scholars wouldn't confirm these calculations until they possessed telescopes and centuries of accumulated data. Yet here it rests in clay, patient and precise, as though Sumerian scribes had simply copied it from some older reference work, whose origins they themselves might not have fully understood. Similar tablets chart the movements of Jupiter, Saturn and Mars across decades of observation, track lunar phases with mathematical precision, and even describe the precession of equinoxes, a wobble in Earth's axis that takes nearly 26,000 years to complete its full cycle. To observe precession requires not just a single lifetime of stargazing, but generation upon generation of data passed down through families of priest astronomers, each adding their observations to a growing archive of celestial knowledge. How could what we consider the first civilization have already possessed such deep understanding of cosmic mechanics, unless they weren't the first at all? Their mathematics proves equally puzzling. Clay fragments contain geometric problems involving right triangles and the relationships between their sides, calculated using principles that wouldn't be formally described by Greek mathematicians for another 1,000 years. These tablets weren't teaching basic concepts or showing the development of mathematical thinking. They were applying advanced principles as practical tools, using them to solve complex engineering problems and design architectural angles with a casual confidence that suggests long familiarity. Other fragments demonstrate understanding of square roots, calculated through iterative methods nearly identical to modern algorithms, knowledge of exponential growth and geometric progressions, and trigonometric relationships that weren't supposed to exist until much later civilizations rediscovered them. The Sumerians weren't developing these mathematical tools through experimentation and discovery. They were employing them as inherited instruments, passed down from some earlier source. Physical artifacts tell equally strange stories. In the ruins of Ur and Eridu, excavators uncovered bronze implements cast with perfect precision, alloyed according to ratios that required exact temperature control and knowledge of metallurgical principles that supposedly took centuries to develop. Yet these tools show no evolutionary progression, no gradual refinement from crude early attempts to sophisticated final products. They appear suddenly in the archaeological record, already optimized, as though the knowledge of advanced metalworking had been transplanted rather than slowly developed. Cylinder seals from ancient Uruk depict what appear to be mechanical devices, wheels, gears, and pulley systems that seem centuries ahead of their supposed technological context. Some seals show figures operating what look like precision instruments, machinery that implies understanding of leverage, torque, and engineering principles. The objects carved into these seals don't match anything else from their supposed time period, yet they're rendered with the careful detail that suggests they represented real, familiar tools rather than imaginary concepts. Then there's the artifact that refuses to fit any conventional timeline, the Baghdad battery, discovered in 1936 near the ruins of ancient Ctesiphon. This device consists of a clay jar containing a copper cylinder and iron rod, components that generate electrical current when filled with acidic liquid. Dated to around 250 BCE, it appears over 2,000 years before Alessandro Volta would supposedly invent the first battery in 1800. Some researchers suggest it was used for electroplating gold onto jewellery, a process that would require understanding of electrochemical principles that weren't supposed to exist in the ancient world. Others argue it was merely a ritual object with no practical function, but the design remains unmistakably purposeful. A primitive electrical device constructed millennia before its time, sitting in layers of occupation that stretch back through Babylonian, Akkadian, and Sumerian periods, each culture building upon the ruins of its predecessors. The Sumerians possessed a word for this kind of inherited knowledge. Mi, often translated as divine decree or sacred ordinance, but carrying meaning far more precise than either translation suggests. The Emi weren't laws or rules imposed from above. They were fundamental codes, principles, and formulas embedded into the structure of reality itself. Each Mi represented a different aspect of existence: kingship, priesthood, metallurgy, writing, warfare, justice, decision-making, agricultural techniques. To possess the Emi was to hold the blueprint of civilization itself. According to their myths, these codes weren't invented by mortals, but were kept by the god Enki in the depths of the Abzu, the primordial waters beneath the earth. They could only be transmitted to humanity through divine will, or occasionally through clever theft. One story tells of the goddess Inanna travelling to Eridu and tricking Enki into giving her the Emi while he was intoxicated. She loaded them onto her boat and sailed back to Uruk, bringing the foundations of civilization with her. What makes this myth particularly intriguing is its underlying assumption that knowledge exists somewhere in complete form, waiting to be accessed rather than discovered. Civilizations rise or fall based on their ability to obtain, preserve, and transmit this knowledge. Progress isn't invention but recovery, the gradual reassembly of scattered pieces from a once complete whole. Perhaps this is what the Sumerians were truly trying to tell us across 5,000 years of silence. That the scientific principles in their tablets, the astronomical observations, the mathematical formulas, the metallurgical techniques weren't products of gradual discovery but results of systematic remembering. They were recovering what the flood had nearly erased, piecing together fragments of understanding that had once been unified and whole. The survivors of the Great Deluge didn't begin from nothing. They began from ruins, and within those ruins were inscriptions, tools, star charts, and formulas. Enough remained to rebuild, if only they could remember what the symbols meant and how the pieces fit together. Perhaps what we call human progress is simply this: the slow, painful process of remembering what we once knew, recovering knowledge that was lost when the old world drowned. Every discovery we make, every scientific principle we uncover, every technological breakthrough we achieve might not represent genuine innovation but recognition, the moment when scattered pieces of ancient understanding finally click back into place. We think we're advancing, but we might actually be returning, following paths that were mapped long before our civilization learned to read the stars. The tablets continue their patient testimony from museum vaults and archaeological archives, each wedge-shaped mark preserving not just information but intention. They were written by people who had witnessed knowledge vanish and were determined that it wouldn't disappear again completely. In their careful preservation of formulas and calculations, in their obsessive documentation of celestial movements and metallurgical processes, we hear the voice of a civilization that understood the fragility of wisdom and the ease with which everything humanity builds can simply wash away. As darkness deepens around us and the modern world settles into its electronic dreams, those ancient voices still whisper their technical specifications and astronomical observations, still preserve their inherited formulas in clay that has outlasted marble and gold, still testify to the possibility that we're not the first to reach for understanding, and that the knowledge we think we're discovering might actually be knowledge we're finally ready to remember. To remember. Yet among all the mysteries preserved in clay, perhaps none is more profound than the language itself. Sumerian stands utterly alone in the vast family tree of human speech, a linguistic orphan with no known relatives, no ancestral roots, no evolutionary pathway leading back to simpler forms. For more than a century, scholars have attempted to connect it to other language families, testing it against Indo-European, Semitic, Dravidian, and even isolated tongues like Basque. Every comparison ends in silence. This isn't merely academic curiosity. Languages don't typically appear from nothing. They evolve, borrow, split from parent tongues through predictable patterns that linguists can trace across millennia. But Sumerian defies these rules entirely. It emerged around 3500 BCE, already fully formed, possessing complex grammar, sophisticated vocabulary, and a writing system precise enough to record everything from poetry to legal codes with equal clarity. There exists no Proto-Sumerian, no transitional forms, no evidence of gradual development from simpler communication systems. The language simply appears in the archaeological record like a gift left by unknown benefactors, complete and ready for use. Then, just as mysteriously, it vanishes around 2000 BCE, surviving only as a sacred tongue used in temples, studied by scribes the way medieval scholars would later study Latin. Even in death, Sumerian haunted the ancient world. Akkadian scribes learned it as a requirement of their profession. Babylonian priests recited it during religious ceremonies. Assyrian kings inscribed it on their monuments. For 2 millennia after it ceased being spoken in daily life, it remained the language of memory, the tongue in which the oldest truths were preserved. To forget it entirely would have meant severing the final connection to whatever had come before. The Sumerians themselves never called their language Sumerian. That designation comes from modern scholars. They knew it as Emegir, which translates approximately as the princely language or the noble tongue, suggesting it held elevated status from its very inception. According to their tablets, writing itself was a gift from Nisaba, the goddess of knowledge, whose name means she who counts the stars. The connection between literacy and astronomical observation wasn't coincidental. To them, language was a form of cosmic measurement, a way of capturing divine speech before it faded into silence. Their writing system, cuneiform, wasn't simply an alphabet as we understand the concept. It was something older and more complex, a layered code where each wedge-shaped mark could represent a sound, a word, or an entire concept depending on context. A single symbol might function as a syllable in one text and carry sacred meaning in another. The signs themselves were geometric patterns, triangles and lines pressed into wet clay with reed styluses, yet within that mathematical precision lay something that felt almost alive. Some scholars have noticed that Sumerian cuneiform signs often mirror natural forms. The symbol for mountain resembles peaks. The sign for water flows like waves. The mark for star radiates light in all directions. It was as though the script didn't merely represent reality, but attempted to capture its essential patterns, trapping the shapes of creation itself in clay before they could dissolve back into chaos. What makes this linguistic mystery even deeper is the discovery of mathematical ratios embedded within Sumerian hymns and religious texts. When linguists analysed the structure of their poetry, they found that syllable counts, stress patterns, and phonetic repetitions followed precise numerical relationships that corresponded to musical intervals. The same ratios that defined harmonic consonants in their music appeared in the rhythm of their language. This suggests something extraordinary. that for the Sumerians, language, mathematics, and music weren't separate disciplines but expressions of a single unified system. To speak correctly was to align oneself with cosmic harmony. To write was to encode that alignment into permanent form. The word they used for this kind of knowledge was me, the same term that described the fundamental codes of reality itself. Perhaps Sumerian wasn't truly a language in the way we understand languages today. It might have been something closer to a programming syntax, designed to interface directly with the underlying structure of existence. If the Great Flood scattered humanity and divided tongues, as later stories would claim, then Sumerian might represent the final surviving fragment of that original universal language, the pre-flood speech that once connected all conscious beings. There's an echo of this idea in the Hebrew Bible, in the story of Babel, where humanity originally spoke with one voice before their language was confused and scattered. The Sumerians may have preserved the last remnant of that unity, carefully transcribed into clay by scribes who sensed they were guardians of something infinitely precious and irretrievably ancient. When modern linguists attempt to speak reconstructed Sumerian aloud, something peculiar happens. The sounds feel simultaneously foreign and familiar, like hearing a melody half remembered from dreams. The vowels roll with unusual depth. The consonants strike with metallic precision. The overall rhythm carries weight that seems to bypass conscious understanding and resonate in deeper places. This linguistic isolation becomes even more haunting when we consider that Sumerian may not have been naturally acquired by children learning their first language. Instead, it might have been a preserved tongue, carefully taught in temple schools to successive generations of scribes who maintained it through ritual repetition rather than native fluency. They were not speaking their mother tongue but reciting the language of their ancestors, keeping alive syllables that carried the memory of a world they themselves had never seen. By the time cuneiform tablets were being inscribed across Mesopotamia, the language itself may already have been ancient, already fragmentary. The scribes weren't recording living speech, but reconstructing something from pieces, the way archaeologists rebuild pottery from shards. They wrote it down obsessively because they knew it was fading. They taught it in schools because they understood that to lose it completely would mean losing the last bridge to whatever had existed before the waters rose. And perhaps they were right. When Sumerian finally died as a spoken language, something irreplaceable vanished from human consciousness. Not just vocabulary or grammar, but an entire way of thinking, a method of encoding reality that could never quite be recovered in any other tongue. The Greeks would later speak of logos, the cosmic word that ordered all existence. The Hebrews would describe the divine speech through which all things were made. But the Sumerians had known this first. Their language carried within it the assumption that words weren't arbitrary sounds humans invented to communicate. They were fundamental vibrations, patterns that shaped matter itself, syllables that once properly arranged could influence the structure of reality. To speak in the ancient tongue was to participate in the ongoing creation of the world, to add one's voice to the cosmic harmony that kept existence stable. Now, in museums around the globe, those wedge-shaped marks rest silent behind protective glass, their sounds unheard for millennia. Yet they continue their patient testimony, preserving not just meaning but intention. They were inscribed by people who believed language was sacred technology, too precious to lose, too powerful to use carelessly. As the night deepens around us and our modern languages buzz through fiber optic cables and radio waves, we might pause to consider what we've gained and lost in translation. Our words travel instantly across continents, but do they still carry the weight of cosmic significance the Sumerians attributed to every carefully placed syllable? We've multiplied human languages into thousands of variants, but have we preserved that original unity of meaning that once allowed heaven and earth to speak as one? The tablets offer no easy answers, only the endless fascination of a mystery that refuses to resolve. They preserve the echoes of a tongue that may have been humanity's first attempt to capture infinity in sound, or perhaps its last connection to a form of consciousness we've since forgotten how to access. Either way, they continue whispering their ancient syllables into the darkness, still counting the stars in a language whose deepest secrets remain locked in clay, waiting for someone to remember how to listen. Deep beneath the desert sands of ancient Mesopotamia, archaeologists have uncovered something that challenges our understanding of how civilizations communicate with the divine. Long after the Sumerian language fell silent, long after the last speakers of that mysterious tongue had vanished into history, humanity continued trying to rebuild the broken bridge between earth and heaven. They constructed monuments that still pierce the desert sky today, massive stepped pyramids that seem to defy the flat landscape around them like artificial mountains rising from nothing. The Sumerians called these structures ziggurats, from words meaning to build high or to reach upward. But these weren't simply temples in the way we might imagine sacred buildings today. They were something far more ambitious and heartbreaking. Landing platforms for gods who no longer descended, cosmic airports built for divine visitors who had stopped arriving. Picture standing at the base of the great ziggurat at Ur, its reconstructed tiers catching moonlight against the empty Iraqi sky. 7 levels rise before you, each one smaller than the last, creating that distinctive stepped silhouette that would influence architecture for millennia to come. But these weren't arbitrary design choices. Each tier was painted a specific colour corresponding to celestial bodies visible to the naked eye. Black for Saturn, red for Mars, gold for the Sun, white for Jupiter. The entire structure functioned as a 3-dimensional map of the cosmos, with each level representing a different sphere of heaven. At the summit of every ziggurat stood a small chamber, furnished not for human occupation but for divine visitation. These rooms contained beds, tables, and offerings of food and drink, maintained by priests who climbed the external staircases each day carrying provisions for gods who might return. The chambers remained ready, doors open to the stars, in case those ancient teachers decided to descend once more as the oldest tablets claim they had before the Great Catastrophe. What makes these monuments so poignant is their obvious futility. The gods, whatever they had been, weren't coming back. The direct communication that Sumerian texts described had been severed, leaving humanity to maintain these elaborate rituals of invitation for beings who had withdrawn beyond reach. Yet the ziggurats continued rising across Mesopotamia for thousands of years, each one a monument to longing rather than worship, a desperate architectural prayer cast upward into silence. The greatest of all these structures stood in ancient Babylon, called a Temenanki, meaning the house of the foundation of heaven and earth. Rising nearly 300 feet into the desert air, it dominated the Mesopotamian plain for miles in every direction, visible to travellers long before they reached the city itself. Greek historians who visited described it with awe, noting its spiral ascending path and the golden chamber at its peak, where local priests insisted the god Marduk would someday rest again. But by the time Greek visitors arrived, even the priests acknowledged they were performing ancient rituals whose original purpose had been forgotten. The ceremonies continued not because anyone expected divine visitors, but because stopping them would mean admitting that the connection had been permanently severed. The ziggurats had become monuments to absence, elaborate structures pointing towards something that was no longer there. This architectural tradition of reaching skyward would echo through subsequent civilizations in ways that still haunt our collective memory. The Tower of Babel, described in Hebrew scripture, bears unmistakable resemblance to these Mesopotamian monuments. According to that account, humanity speaking a single language gathered to build a tower reaching toward heaven, only to have their speech confused and their work abandoned when divine forces intervened. But the Hebrew version presents this as punishment for human pride, a cautionary tale about the dangers of reaching too high. The Sumerian perspective was entirely different. To them, the towers weren't acts of defiance but of remembrance, desperate attempts to restore what the flood had destroyed. Not just cities and temples, but the bridge itself, the connection that had once allowed knowledge to flow freely between mortal and divine realms. The confusion of tongues wasn't divine punishment in the Sumerian understanding. It was tragedy, the final severing of the unified language that had once carried the fundamental codes of existence. After Babel, there was no single speech that could properly encode the cosmic ratios, no universal tongue that resonated with the structure of reality itself. There were only fragments, scattered dialects carrying pieces of meaning that had once formed a coherent whole. Without that unified language, the towers could never achieve their true purpose. They weren't meant to be mere architectural achievements, but communication devices, cosmic transmitters designed to broadcast the proper frequencies that would call the teachers back. Without the correct linguistic codes, the structures became just stone and brick, empty monuments pointing toward a heaven that had learned not to listen. From that silence emerged the fragmented history we recognize today. No longer the unified world of the pre-Diluvian kings, but a scattered humanity speaking different languages, building separate civilizations, each trying to remember what had been lost but no longer able to share that memory across the distances created by linguistic division. The ziggurats remained scattered across ancient Mesopotamia, slowly eroding under wind and rain as centuries passed. Priests continued their daily climbs, carrying offerings to empty chambers, singing hymns in dead languages to gods who no longer descended. The rituals persisted not from faith, but from habit, the way muscle memory continues long after conscious purpose has been forgotten. Yet something remarkable happened to the knowledge these monuments were meant to preserve. It didn't disappear entirely, but transformed, dispersing into streams that would flow through later civilizations in unexpected ways. The geometry of the ziggurats influenced Egyptian pyramid construction. Their astronomical alignments guided Greek temple orientation. Their mathematical proportions appeared in Roman engineering and Gothic cathedral design. Even today, when we divide circles into 360 degrees or measure time in units of 60, we're unconsciously employing Sumerian mathematical systems. Their base 60 counting appears in our clocks and our navigation instruments. Their constellation maps still guide our understanding of the night sky. The very calendar we use to mark our days carries forward their calculations of celestial cycles and seasonal changes. Perhaps this was the real purpose of those ancient towers, not to bring the gods back down to earth, but to ensure that human knowledge would continue reaching upward, even after direct divine communication had ended. Each ziggurat functioned as a repository of accumulated wisdom, a three-dimensional textbook where priest astronomers could study the relationships between earthly geometry and celestial mechanics. The priests who maintained these structures were more than religious functionaries. They were the keepers of continuity, preserving mathematical formulas, astronomical observations, and architectural principles that might otherwise have vanished with the civilizations that created them. When empires fell and languages died, the knowledge encoded in stone and ritual continued forward, carried by scholars who understood its value even when they'd forgotten its origins. In the deeper chambers beneath some ziggurats, archaeologists have discovered libraries containing thousands of tablets, covering subjects from medicine to metallurgy, from agricultural techniques to musical theory. These weren't random collections, but carefully curated archives, preserved by people who understood that knowledge could vanish as completely as if it had never existed. The priests who tended these libraries worked like archaeologists of their own past, copying and recopying texts they could barely understand, translating ancient formulas into contemporary languages, maintaining traditions whose original meanings had been lost to time. They sensed they were guardians of something precious and irreplaceable, though they might not have fully grasped what they were protecting. As night settles over the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia, those broken towers still catch starlight on their weathered stones. The chambers at their peaks remain empty, their divine furniture long since crumbled to dust. Yet in museums around the world, the knowledge they were built to preserve continues breathing through clay tablets and cylinder seals, through mathematical principles and astronomical observations, through architectural techniques that still shape how we build. The ziggurats failed in their primary mission. The gods never returned to rest in their prepared chambers. But they succeeded in something perhaps more important. They created a system for preserving human knowledge that could survive the collapse of civilizations, the confusion of languages, and the passage of millennia. In their reaching toward absent heavens, they ensured that at least some fragment of ancient wisdom would remain accessible to future generations, willing to climb those worn stone steps and listen to what the silence between the stars might still be trying to teach us about the world we've inherited and the knowledge we've almost lost. Standing among those crumbling monuments today, one can almost feel the weight of accumulated centuries pressing down through layers of silence. But the story doesn't end with empty towers and abandoned chambers. Hidden beneath the sand and scattered across museum collections worldwide lies evidence of something far more systematic than random preservation of ancient knowledge. The priest astronomers who maintained those ziggurats were part of an intricate network of scholars who understood that civilization itself hung by the thinnest of threads. In the shadowed corridors of Babylonian temples, long after the Sumerian language had become a relic studied only by scribes, these guardians of continuity developed what might be called the world's first systematic approach to knowledge preservation. They weren't simply copying old tablets or maintaining ritual traditions. They were engaged in something approaching modern scientific methodology, observing celestial movements with mathematical precision, cataloguing medicinal compounds with clinical detail, and recording metallurgical formulas with chemical accuracy. The Temple of Esagil in Babylon wasn't merely a house of worship, but functioned as an ancient research institution where priest scholars called Baru and Ashipu spent decades learning not just religious ceremonies, but mathematics, medicine, and astronomical calculation. Their training could last an entire lifetime, beginning in childhood with memorization of thousands of cuneiform signs and progressing through increasingly complex studies of geometry, chemistry, and celestial mechanics. These weren't separate disciplines as we might categorize them today. To the Babylonian scholars, healing a wound involved understanding numerical relationships. Predicting eclipses required knowledge of musical harmonies. Every aspect of their learning interconnected through mathematical principles that linked sound, matter, and motion in a single coherent system. Their methods of preservation were remarkably sophisticated. Rather than simply copying texts verbatim, they developed cross-referencing systems that allowed knowledge to survive even if individual tablets were damaged or lost. Multiple copies of important documents were distributed across different temples, each one slightly modified to account for local conditions while preserving essential information. When they recorded astronomical observations, they didn't simply note what they saw, but embedded their data within complex mathematical frameworks that revealed underlying patterns spanning centuries. Their eclipse predictions were accurate enough that modern computers can verify their calculations thousands of years later. Their Venus tablets tracked planetary movements with such precision that contemporary astronomers use them to refine historical chronologies. But perhaps most remarkably, they developed what we might recognize as early forms of scientific peer review. Important observations weren't accepted until multiple scholars from different cities had confirmed them independently. Mathematical formulas were tested against practical applications before being added to the permanent archive. Medical treatments were documented not just as procedures, but with careful notation of their effectiveness rates. This systematic approach to knowledge preservation allowed information to survive catastrophes that would have obliterated less organized systems. When Alexander the Great conquered Babylon in 331 BCE, he ordered the translation of temple archives into Greek, but most were misunderstood by scholars who lacked the mathematical background to interpret them properly. The surviving Babylonian priests withdrew into Persia and Syria, carrying with them the last keys to understanding these ancient codes. By the 1st century BCE, the final generation of these scholar priests had scattered across the known world. Some became the mysterious figures known as magi, following astronomical calculations that led them to witness events they believed were foretold in their ancient star charts. Others disappeared into mountain retreats, taking with them knowledge that would surface centuries later in alchemical texts and hermetic traditions. The echoes of their system survived in ways that still influence how we organize information today. The library at Alexandria, often celebrated as the ancient world's greatest repository of knowledge, was actually modelled on Babylonian temple archives. The classification systems used by medieval Islamic scholars derived from organizational principles developed by Mesopotamian priest astronomers. Even our modern scientific method, with its emphasis on observation, mathematical analysis, and peer review, follows patterns first established in those ancient temple schools. Yet something crucial was lost in these transmissions. The Babylonian scholars hadn't simply preserved knowledge as abstract information. They understood it as living wisdom that required proper context to remain meaningful. Their mathematical formulas weren't just calculations, but encoded principles of cosmic harmony. Their medical treatments weren't merely procedures, but applications of universal healing laws. Their astronomical observations weren't just data, but communion with divine order. When later civilizations inherited fragments of this wisdom, they often lacked the cultural framework necessary to understand its deeper significance. Greek philosophers transformed Mesopotamian cosmic mathematics into abstract geometry. Roman engineers reduced sacred architectural proportions to practical construction techniques. Medieval alchemists preserved chemical formulas without grasping their original spiritual dimensions. The result was a gradual fragmentation of unified knowledge into separate specializations. What had once been understood as a single coherent system, describing the fundamental patterns of existence, became divided into distinct academic disciplines that rarely communicated with each other. We gained precision but lost perspective, achieving remarkable technological capabilities while forgetting the broader context that gave them meaning. This process of fragmentation wasn't entirely negative. It allowed human knowledge to expand rapidly by focusing intense attention on specific areas of study. but it also created blind spots that we're only beginning to recognize. Modern physicists searching for unified field theories are essentially trying to reconstruct the kind of comprehensive understanding that Babylonian scholars took for granted. Contemporary researchers studying consciousness are rediscovering principles that ancient priest astronomers encoded in their mathematical descriptions of cosmic harmony. Environmental scientists are finding that traditional ecological knowledge preserved by indigenous cultures often contains insights that modern analytical methods have overlooked. Perhaps most intriguingly, computer scientists working on artificial intelligence are encountering problems that mirror those faced by Mesopotamian scholars trying to preserve knowledge across generational transitions. How do you encode not just information, but wisdom? How do you ensure that future recipients will understand not just the data, but its proper application? How do you maintain continuity of understanding when the cultural context that gives meaning to knowledge inevitably changes? The Babylonian solution involved creating multiple redundant systems that approached the same information from different angles. They preserved mathematical principles in architectural proportions, encoded astronomical data in mythological narratives, and embedded medical knowledge in ritual practices. If one transmission method failed, others might survive to carry the essential information forward. Their approach recognized something we're only beginning to appreciate: that knowledge isn't simply information, but a living relationship between consciousness and reality that must be continuously renewed in each generation. The tablets and monuments they left behind weren't just storage devices, but interfaces, designed to facilitate ongoing dialogue between ancient wisdom and contemporary understanding. As we sit in the gathering darkness, surrounded by our own vast archives of digital information, we might consider what lessons these ancient knowledge keepers offer for our own preservation challenges. Our data may travel at light speed across global networks, but does it carry the depth of meaning that allowed Mesopotamian wisdom to survive for millennia? We can access more information than any previous generation, but have we lost the integrative understanding that made ancient knowledge systems so remarkably durable? The priest astronomers who climbed those ziggurat steps each night, carrying their observations and calculations toward empty chambers, understood something we're struggling to rediscover: that preserving knowledge isn't just about storing information, but about maintaining the living connections that give information meaning. Their empty towers still point towards stars that continue following the same mathematical patterns they calculated thousands of years ago, still waiting for someone willing to climb those ancient steps and listen to what the silence between earth and heaven might still be trying to teach us. In the deepest archives beneath those forgotten temples, clay tablets continue their patient testimony, preserving not just the formulas and observations of vanished civilizations, but the methodology that allowed human knowledge to survive the collapse of empires and the confusion of tongues. They remind us that wisdom isn't just what we know, but how we remember, and that the greatest discoveries might not be new revelations, but recovered understandings of truths we once knew, but somehow forgot along the way. In the final hours before dawn, when the desert wind carries whispers across the ruins of ancient cities, we encounter perhaps the most haunting chapter in this story of lost knowledge and broken connections. For buried beneath layers of sand and time lies evidence of something that challenges our most fundamental assumptions about the nature of civilization itself. The tablets speak not just of knowledge preserved, but of knowledge actively hidden, encoded in symbols and stories that were meant to survive even the most complete catastrophes. The scribes who worked in those temple archives weren't simply copying old text or maintaining academic traditions. They were engaged in something far more urgent and desperate. They were racing against time itself, trying to preserve the last fragments of understanding before some approaching darkness could erase them entirely. Their cuneiform marks carry the weight of prophecy as much as history, written by hands that trembled not just with age but with the knowledge of what was coming. Consider the strange precision with which certain tablets were buried, not scattered randomly by conquest or natural disaster, but carefully placed in sealed chambers, wrapped in protective materials, accompanied by detailed instructions for future discoverers, written in multiple languages. These weren't casual archives, but deliberate time capsules, created by people who understood that their entire world was about to vanish and wanted to ensure that someone, somewhere, in some distant age might recover what was about to be lost. The mathematics encoded in these hidden caches goes beyond even the sophisticated astronomy and engineering we've already encountered. Here, we find formulas that describe natural phenomena in ways that wouldn't be rediscovered by modern science for millennia. Equations that model wave propagation through different media, calculations that predict the behavior of what we now call fluid dynamics, geometric theorems that anticipate principles of crystallography and molecular structure. Most unsettling of all are the medical texts that describe human anatomy with accuracy that shouldn't have been possible without dissection and systematic study, yet are presented as inherited knowledge passed down from earlier sources. These documents don't read like the careful observations of pioneering researchers, but like condensed summaries of a much larger body of work, as though someone had taken vast libraries of accumulated medical knowledge and distilled them into essential principles that could be memorized and transmitted even if all the original sources were destroyed. The same pattern appears in their metallurgical records. Instead of gradual development from simple smelting to complex alloy creation, we find immediate mastery of techniques that require understanding of atomic structure and chemical bonding. Their bronze formulas achieve properties that modern metallurgists can replicate but struggle to improve upon. Their methods for working with precious metals demonstrate knowledge of electrochemical processes that weren't supposed to exist in the ancient world. Yet perhaps the most profound mystery lies in what these archives don't contain. For all their mathematical sophistication and technical knowledge, there's an absence that speaks louder than any inscription. These civilizations possessed understanding that we're only beginning to recover, yet they show no evidence of the technological infrastructure we associate with advanced science. No evidence of machinery complex enough to require such sophisticated knowledge. No archaeological trace of the instruments that would have been necessary to make the observations their calculations describe. It's as though they possessed the theoretical framework of an advanced technological civilization, but were deliberately maintaining a simpler material culture. As if the knowledge existed independent of the tools typically needed to discover it. The implications are staggering and deeply unsettling. Were they working from inherited blueprints for technologies they chose not to build? Were they preserving scientific principles from a more advanced predecessor culture, while living deliberately simpler lives themselves? The deeper we penetrate these archives, the more we encounter references to something the scribes called the Great Forgetting, a catastrophe more complete than any flood or earthquake. Not just the destruction of cities or the death of populations, but the erasure of knowledge itself. The tablets describe this event with terminology that sounds almost modern, referring to the breakdown of communication networks, the failure of information storage systems, the collapse of educational institutions that had preserved learning for countless generations. They write of a time when the accumulated wisdom of ages simply vanished, leaving survivors who possessed individual pieces of knowledge but no framework for understanding how those pieces fit together. Imagine having access to advanced mathematical formulas but forgetting what they were meant to calculate. Picture knowing sophisticated medical procedures but losing the understanding of why they worked. Consider possessing detailed star charts but no longer remembering what cosmic events they were meant to predict. This is what the Mesopotamian archives suggest actually happened. The knowledge they preserved so desperately wasn't their own discoveries but fragments salvaged from the wreckage of something far more comprehensive. They were working like archaeologists of their own forgotten past, trying to reconstruct understanding from scattered clues whose original context had been lost. Their approach to preservation reflects this understanding. They didn't simply record information, but embedded it in multiple overlapping systems designed to survive partial destruction. Mathematical principles were encoded in architectural proportions so they would persist even if written records were lost. Astronomical data was woven into mythological narratives that could be transmitted orally across generations. Medical knowledge was incorporated into religious rituals that would be maintained even if the theoretical understanding disappeared. This redundant encoding explains many of the mysteries that have puzzled archaeologists for decades. Why do ancient monuments incorporate mathematical relationships that seem unnecessarily complex for their apparent functions? Why do mythological stories contain detailed astronomical information disguised as divine genealogies? Why do religious ceremonies preserve chemical and pharmacological knowledge within their symbolic actions? The answer appears to be that these weren't separate cultural expressions but components of an integrated preservation system designed by people who had witnessed the complete collapse of knowledge networks and were determined to prevent it from happening again. Every temple was a library. Every myth was a textbook. Every ritual was a scientific procedure maintained through repetition, even when its original purpose was no longer understood. Yet even this sophisticated preservation system wasn't enough to prevent gradual degradation. With each generation, more of the original context was lost. Formulas were preserved, but their applications forgotten. Procedures were maintained, but their underlying principles misunderstood. Stories continued to be told, but their encoded information was increasingly interpreted as pure fantasy rather than preserved data. By the time classical civilizations encountered these traditions, most had already transformed from functional knowledge systems into purely symbolic practices. Greek philosophers inherited Mesopotamian mathematical concepts, but lacked the cultural context to understand their original applications. Roman engineers adopted architectural techniques without grasping the astronomical and harmonic principles that had guided their development. Medieval scholars preserved alchemical formulas without recognizing their basis in practical chemistry and metallurgy. The result was the strange hybrid we encounter throughout ancient history: civilizations that possessed fragments of advanced knowledge but seemed to use it in ways that appear primitive or superstitious to modern eyes. They weren't being irrational or mystical. They were working with inherited tools whose instruction manuals had been lost, trying to maintain systems whose original design principles they could no longer access. This perspective transforms our understanding of what we call the Dark Ages. Rather than representing humanity's emergence from ignorance, they might actually represent the final stages of a much longer process of forgetting. The medieval period wasn't when civilization began its climb toward knowledge, but when it finally lost the last coherent fragments of much older understanding. The Renaissance that followed wasn't the birth of scientific thinking, but its rediscovery, as scholars began finding and translating ancient texts that preserved pieces of knowledge systems that had once been far more comprehensive than anything medieval Europe had imagined possible. What we celebrate as the scientific revolution might actually represent humanity's gradual recovery from a catastrophic loss of understanding that had occurred thousands of years earlier. This interpretation casts our modern achievements in a different light. Are we pioneering new frontiers of knowledge or simply retracing paths that were mapped long before our civilization learned to read? When we split atoms or decode genetic structures or model quantum mechanics, are we making genuine discoveries or recovering understanding that was lost when some earlier world forgot how to remember? The archives buried beneath Mesopotamian sands offer no definitive answers, only the haunting suggestion that human knowledge might be far older and far more fragile than we've ever imagined. They preserve the voices of people who understood that everything we build can be lost, that wisdom can vanish as completely as if it never existed, and that the greatest civilizations might be those whose names we'll never know, because even the memory of their existence has been washed away by time. In the gathering darkness, those ancient voices continue their testimony, from clay tablets scattered across museum collections worldwide. They speak in mathematical formulas and astronomical calculations, in medical procedures and metallurgical techniques, in architectural principles and harmonic ratios. But underneath all the technical knowledge lies a simpler and more urgent message: that preservation requires more than storage, that understanding demands more than information, and that the wisdom to remember what matters most might be the most precious knowledge of all. The tablets remain patient in their climate-controlled cases, still carrying the weight of that ancient responsibility, still preserving what they could salvage from the wreckage of whatever came before, still whispering their encoded warnings into the silence, hoping that someone, somewhere, in some distant age will finally understand what they were trying so desperately to save. Desperately to save. As we reach the end of our journey through these ancient mysteries, we find ourselves standing at the edge of a profound realization that stretches across the darkness like a bridge between worlds. The evidence scattered through museum archives and buried beneath desert sands points toward a conclusion that should humble every assumption we've made about human progress and the nature of knowledge itself. The clay tablets continue their silent testimony, each wedge-shaped mark pressed by hands that understood something we're only beginning to glimpse. They weren't simply recording their present moment or preserving religious traditions. They were engaged in the most desperate act of love imaginable, trying to save the future from repeating the catastrophic losses of the past. What emerges from this evidence isn't just the story of one lost civilization, but a pattern that seems to repeat across vast cycles of time. Knowledge accumulates, civilizations rise, understanding reaches remarkable heights, and then something happens. Not always a flood, not always a single catastrophic event, but a gradual or sudden forgetting that erases centuries of accumulated wisdom as completely as if it never existed. Tonight, as the world settles into sleep and ancient whispers drift through the darkness, perhaps we've touched something that was meant to be remembered. The Sumerian tablets don't just preserve the memory of impossible kings and divine teachers, they preserve a warning written in clay and time itself, that everything we think we know about human history might be backwards, that our greatest achievements might be our faintest recollections, and that somewhere beneath the flood-buried ruins of the world that was lies the blueprint for understanding who we really are and where we're truly going. Sleep well, knowing that in museums across the globe those patient clay voices continue their testimony through the night, still counting impossible years, still whispering of restoration, still waiting for the moment when we finally remember how to listen.